We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Little children, let us love, not in word or in speech, but in truth and action. And by this we will know that we are from truth and will reassure our hearts before him whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts, and God knows everything. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have boldness before God, and we receive from God whatever we ask, because we obey God's commandments and do what pleases God. And this is God's commandment, that we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. All who obey his commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit that he has given us. The word of the Lord. So I was a little reluctant to preach on this passage this morning for 3 reasons. The first is that it is Earth Day, and at first glance I was really struggling to connect the dots on what, if anything, in this passage had to do with earth or creation or the good gifts that God has given us. The second reason is that this Sunday is also known as Good Shepherd Sunday. And you may have noticed that both our psalm and our gospel reading had something to do with shepherds, and therefore also with sheep. And while I have heard and read many an interesting sermon that built upon the qualities of shepherds and sheep, I know little to nothing about either. So stretching that metaphor into this reading seemed a little daunting to me. And third, and probably the most important reason I was reluctant to preach on this passage, is that it has to do with love. Love is one of those things that we think we know it when we see it. We know it when we feel it. We know it when we witness it. But even though sometimes we can recognize it, other times it still eludes us. Sometimes we don't recognize it at all. Sometimes we mistake it for something that we really like or admire or want. Rarely do we take the time to give our full attention or presence to the commitment that real love requires. Many times we think that by naming something love, by speaking about it, by giving it lip service, we can make up for our lack of attention to all that love requires of us. Sometimes our speech, our words about love replace our efforts to love. And love is beyond words. Earlier this year, I picked up a book by that title, Beyond Words. It's not a typical book that I would ordinarily pick out because I love novels, and it's not a novel, although it often reads like one. It's a book written by Dr. Carl Safina, an ecologist and an award-winning author. Beyond Words is a book about animal behavior, of all things, and was written in an effort to challenge our fixed boundary between humans and non-human animals. I guess the thing that attracted me to this book in the first place was the picture on the front cover. Yes, I'm one of those. But it's a sweet picture of an adult and a juvenile elephant presumably a mother and a baby, pressing their faces against each other. Ever since I visited the elephant orphanage near Tsavo National Park, where our sister congregation is in Voi, Kenya, I have been drawn to elephants. And the picture on the cover alone seems to convey this idea that love is beyond words. In the passage we read this morning, the author of 1 John is also trying to figure out how he can convey the concept and idea of love when its description is beyond words. This author is dealing with the ever-present tension of trying to describe love to a floundering Christian community, his floundering Christian community, with words, all the while knowing that ultimately words are going to leave him short of an adequate description. Because love isn't just a word, it's a feeling, it's special knowledge, it's action, it's something that has to be shared in order to be recognized. It can't be possessed or contained. It's so much more. Love is more than. And we feel this tension in the very first line of the passage that we read this morning. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. Love demands our action. Love demands our whole lives. The first third of the book by Dr. Safina is about elephants, and I enjoyed it very much. But I was anticipating enjoying that. Having had young elephants wrap their trunks around my arm in an effort to make a connection, I knew I was going to like that part. But I wasn't prepared to enjoy the next section of the book. Those chapters were about wolves. And while I would say that I am sort of in awe of wolves, they do not produce that same warm, fuzzy feeling in me that elephants do. They are predators, and they're a little scary. And every nursery rhyme and children's story I ever heard had a big, bad wolf in it. So my cultural associations with wolves are not that positive. But I was surprised to learn about the complexity of their family lives together in a pack. See, wolf packs often fight one another for territory and land and food. And sometimes their pups end up being collateral damage in those fights. Safina writes about one particular wolf named 06. She was one of the most loved and most watched wolves in all of Yellowstone National Park. One writer commented in the Yellowstone reports that 06 had an unbelievable ability to sense when things were not right in her pack. One day, her pack encountered an enemy pack while hunting, and she immediately took off and ran, causing the entire other pack to chase her. 06 against 16 enemy wolves are not very good odds, but being familiar with the territory, she sneakily escaped using a tiny gully near the cliff edge that she ran towards. Knowing that the other pack was unfamiliar with the territory, they couldn't figure out how she got down into the valley. But wolves are not stupid, and she had led them dangerously close to her den. They could have easily followed her scent and killed all of her pups, if not for one thing. One of her adult daughters appeared at the cliff and stood in plain sight of the tired and frustrated enemy pack. And in their frustration, they turned to chase this wolf, and she easily outran them, leading them far away from her mother's den. Now, call that natural instinct, but I call it love. Sacrificial, risky, daring, vulnerable love shared by a mother and her adult daughter willing to offer their lives for the pups in the den. We hear so much about love in our lives that sometimes we forget how important love is, not just for our thriving, but also for our surviving. The author of 1 John recognizes that the good news is about love. God so loved the world that he sent his only Son. This is my commandment, that you love one another. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am nothing. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your strength and with all your soul and with all of your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Peter, do you love me? Now, these three remain: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. The fruit of the Spirit is love. The author of 1 John was in a difficult position. He tasks himself with convincing the people of the necessity of love for Christian life. But at the same time, he wants to convey that that life of love requires more than speech, more than words. Now, 1 John isn't a very long book, but it contains more references to love than any other book in the New Testament, including the Gospels. It has to be frustrating to try and convey to a struggling, floundering community that the one defining characteristic of God and of God's children is a completely indescribable trait. And to know that that indescribable trait must also necessarily be communicated some way. 1 John is an interesting book because it really is a commentary on the Gospel of John. It attempts to take the ideas of that gospel and reinterpret them and make them real for a new generation. So you may be interested to know that references to love also appear twice as often in the Gospel of John than they do in any of the other Gospels. The Gospel of John starts with these words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. The author of 1 John starts this epistle in a similar way. We declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And in verse 11 of chapter 3 that we read from this morning, and just a few verses prior to what we read, the author writes, "For this message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." Now, I know that one of our adult Sunday school classes just finished studying the Gospel of John. But for those of you who aren't as familiar with that gospel, it's helpful to know that the author of John likes to use the word beginning as a way of reminding everyone about creation, that it is God's creation and that God has been present in and with and among creation from the very beginning. So John's gospel, John's good news about Jesus, is consistent with God's message from the very beginning. So if we take this author of 1 John seriously, if we consider the good news in which he believed and which he wanted to convey, then we cannot escape the idea that love has something to do with creation, the creation in which we live and breathe and have our very being. When Congress established Yellowstone National Park in 1872, there was no federal agency to protect it. And in 1886, the poaching was so prevalent in that park that the U.S. military was sent in to fight it. After killing tens and thousands of bison on the Great Plains, people began to realize that the protection of the 23 bison that remained alive in the park was crucial for the survival of that species. But bison are not a predator, and predators in the park did not enjoy the same protection. In 1916, with the establishment of the National Park Service, rangers were instructed to exterminate predators from the park, including mountain lions, lynx, bobcats, coyotes, and wolves. In 1926, the last Yellowstone wolf was killed. And for 69 years, there were no wolves in Yellowstone National Park. On January 12, 1995, an alpha pair and 4 male pups were introduced into the park. 31 wolves were released between 1995 and 1996, finally restoring to Yellowstone its full roster of native animals that had been there from the beginning. As wolf numbers flourished, elk overcrowding declined. This was expected. This was what was hoped for. It was intended to be the result of the reintroduction of wolves into the park. Director of the Center for Excellence in Preaching and faculty member of Calvin Theological Seminary, Scott E. Hosey writes, "Creation itself sprang from the bubbling overflow of God's love. That God was under no compulsion to create anything, but God wanted, maybe even needed to share the love and life already shared between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because that love was so great that it could not be contained. It had nowhere to go, so it bubbled over and gushed forth creation everywhere." The reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone had other profound impacts on the park that were never imagined. Wolves helped liberate the aspens and the cottonwood saplings and other vegetation from the appetites of too many elk. And once vegetation began recovering, beavers returned to the stream banks, and they built dams. And in the quieted pools behind the beaver-built dams appeared other creatures: muskrats, frogs, salamanders, fishes, and ducks, all very important to the ecosystems in that park. Even songbirds returned to the streams. When our whole lives are laid down for one another, creation has no choice but to burst through and shower its love on everything. A love that is beyond words, a lesson taught not just by the earth or by shepherds and the cute little sheep, or by words or by speech. A lesson that can even be taught by the wolves. Amen.